Hello, everyone. Hi, Charles. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, nice to meet you. Thanks.
Yeah. So today I wanted to do a topic about the differences between living in the three jurisdictions that I am licensed in, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Because I very frequently get a client who says, hey, let's just make an example up here. I'm going to work at the State Department. I could live in Foggy Bottom. I could live in Eastern or somewhere, downtown.
Mm-hmm.
I could also live in Rosslyn. Maybe I should buy in Rosslyn because Virginia is cheaper. And it starts us down a very long path of saying, how do you really compare these different jurisdictions so that somebody can make an educated guess based on not only their wants and needs, but how the transaction will play out, what the costs associated are, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So I brought you on here today because you're an attorney and you deal with your firm that you're with. KVS does a lot of closings that I work with, and you're my go-to for all real estate attorney questions.
We appreciate that.
And so anyway, I thought it would be good to just talk about some of these differences today. And honestly, I think we could have multiple episodes about various content, and we could really go down rabbit holes about some of this specifically.
Absolutely.
I also think it's important to point out that we are not necessarily like if we start talking about taxes, we're not accountants. We're not giving anybody tax, advice or anything to that effect, but we can tell you the differences between the laws and stuff like that.
Right.
So anyway, to kick things off, what do you want to talk about here? Let's talk about the difference in taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I think before we dive into it, right?
Sure.
It's important to know that, like the DMV is like a very unique area compared to like the rest of the country, right? Like I grew up in California and it was just like, you live in California. But here, when you move to DC, you have these three choices, right? So something to think about, like, cost of living, income taxes, right? That we'll get into here, and sort of like the purchasing of property. Like, what are some of those nuances, right? And we'll talk about property taxes, right? So when you buy a house, not every place in America does this, but in Virginia, DC, and Maryland, you have these things called recordation taxes. And they're basically like sales taxes whenever you buy property, right? So each jurisdiction has a different recordation tax amount, right? So one of the things that we were just talking about, Alison and I, right? We were just talking about like how much is the recordation tax for each of the three jurisdictions. So you were mentioning that some people think Virginia is cheaper, right? And so for recordation taxes, that's exactly right. Like the one-time sales tax that you pay whenever you buy property in Virginia, out of the three is going to be the cheapest Virginia is. But when you get into Maryland, Maryland's the second most expensive, and then Virginia or DC has the highest recordation taxes. But this is like that one-time sales tax that you're paying whenever you purchase property, right? And it's something that a lot of people don't know when they first move into the jurisdictions is that each jurisdiction also has like different incentives on having buyers, first-time home buyers move into the area, right? So Virginia, while it's cheaper on a normal by default, right, for recordation taxes, DC and Maryland, they both have first-time home buyer programs. So if you're eligible for it, you can reduce that recordation tax, right?
Yeah, I mean, something that I always think of is when you have a first-time home buyer, it's very common. I mean, I can only speak for this area, but for agents in the area to do a first-time home buyer kind of presentation. But the fact is, this is definitely applicable to people who have purchased and sold several houses just outside of this area because some of this stuff is so different.
Right.
So I found that seasoned home buyers, they're like, well, I'm not a first-time buyer. I was like, but you're a first-time home buyer here.
Yeah, right.
So these things are important to go over.
Yeah, especially like the DC one and the Maryland one, right? It's regardless of where you've lived, if you've owned houses anywhere else, as long as you're a first-time Maryland home buyer or a DC home buyer, you're eligible for that deduction on your recordation taxes. Yeah. And then we can talk about like practices as well, but like, I'll get a lot of people who come here from like New York or California, and they're sort of used to like having to hire different people and things like that, right? Like agents, right? Here, I think agents do it all, right? Whereas in like New York and stuff like that, they have to like go talk to a separate attorney to like explain the contract to them and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I only work, well, it's not obvious. I guess I could have a license elsewhere, but I've only been licensed in real
Mhm.
estate in this area before. And I have
Right.
tons of people who are coming from different areas of the country
Mhm.
to work with me here. And I've been just flabbergasted by how different it
Yeah.
can be outside of this area. I mean, even to keep the differences between these two jurisdictions straight can
Mhm.
be challenging at times.
Right.
All of these jurisdictions are changing their
Mhm.
laws and their regulations and their paperwork, with
Right.
relative
Right.
frequency. And then, yeah, I've got a client coming from New York right now,
Mhm.
and they started talking about, how their closing is moving, and they have to talk to their attorney about it. And I was like, your
Mhm.
attorney? What do you
Right.
mean? But an attorney is involved in every settlement, I think, in New York, which,
Yeah.
you know, um, and to a different degree than real estate attorneys are involved here.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, I think in New York, it's like each side has their own attorney, whereas
Mm-hmm.
here it's like normally you just have one that's sort of like a third party that puts it all together for
Yep.
everybody. Mhm.
Yep. Okay, so laws and or sorry, so taxes
Mhm.
and so I mean, really, I think what it comes down to is what I tell my clients is it's more or less a wash
Mhm.
with like the taxes and the
Right.
incentives and stuff like that. Um, the next thing that I talk about all the time with my clients,
Mhm.
so I think I don't know if I already said this, but people never really are looking at all three. It's usually like Maryland, DC,
Right.
or it's Virginia
Mhm.
and DC. And sometimes you have Maryland and Virginia, but it's usually two of the three jurisdictions.
Mhm.
And I usually have to have this conversation with them when somebody is looking at Virginia as an
Mhm.
option
Okay.
because
Yeah.
this level of disclosure.
Mhm.
So Virginia is a buyer beware state. Basically, you go to buy a house and the seller has filled
Yeah.
out this, I can't remember, is it a property disclosure
Yeah, it's
form? I think it's
the
called,
Virginia Residential Property Disclosure
which
Act.
basically says
Right.
nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's basically like, hey, you're buying a house, you have to find out everything on your own, right?
Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
And then you've got DC and Maryland, which are much more disclosure friendly
Mhm. Right.
areas where sellers are filling out age of systems,
Mhm.
any known, all the known issues that they have. They have to make sure everybody is aware of those things.
Mhm.
And so for me, when you're buying a place, it's not necessarily like a monetary thing about where it's cheaper to live or more expensive to live, but it
Right.
certainly affects the process of
Mhm.
when you're buying a home and the
Yeah.
differences in going through that process.
Right. I think like the telltale sign is like how much paperwork is involved when you make an offer, right? In Virginia, like the contract is only 13 pages, right? And then you may have some contingencies. But whenever you get like a DC file, because just like you mentioned, the seller has to disclose so much information about like the systems, the roof, things like that, right? All of that, all those pages start adding up. So yeah, like that's sort of like the telltale sign of like how much more disclosure is necessary, right?
Yeah, and it
Mhm.
doesn't mean like I think I say that to first time
Yeah.
home buyers and they freak out and they're like, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, the seller doesn't
Right.
have to tell me anything. And I said,
Mhm.
I was like, listen, these are people have disclosed what they know. So a
Right.
home can always have problems that people
Hmm.
are unaware of.
Right.
No one's a mind reader. So as somebody who's selling their
Hmm.
house might not know that there's a problem in the
Yeah.
wall. And so that can happen regardless of what jurisdiction you're in. However,
Exactly.
that's why I put a different amount of importance on a home inspection in
Hmm.
Virginia
Yeah.
versus, say, DC or Maryland,
Right.
because in Virginia, you truly don't know anything
Hmm.
about the house, or sorry, I shouldn't say anything. You know very, very little about
Yeah.
that house. And so I think it's really more important there to have an inspection.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. And I think like right now, you can get home inspections. Like you can sort of do like the home inspection when you go take a look at the property, right? And
Yep.
then I've still seen like with you can do the home inspections for information purposes only. And then, even though people have been waiving home inspections, I still see, here or there, a home inspection contingency get put in there, right? So, yeah,
I'm very lucky. I've gotten them in all my contracts this spring. I don't know how. I know I'm completely the
yeah.
anomaly, and I should knock on wood right now because I'm going to I'm going to ruin my track record right now. But yeah. Um,
I think
so
you're doing a good job.
oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that vein, about how much
Mhm.
you're how friendly these the documentation is basically towards a buyer or a seller. So
Right.
we said it's buyer beware with Virginia, meaning it favors the seller.
Mm-hmm.
And in Virginia, or sorry, in DC, Maryland, I would say it's the opposite. It favors the buyer with all the disclosures.
Mm-hmm.
So I also have a lot of people who come to me. Again, let's use this person who's working at the State Department.
Mm-hmm.
They are only going to be here for 3 years. They want to buy a home, but then they want to rent it out afterwards. They're almost definite that that's going to happen, that is part of the trajectory of their homeowning experience. So rental laws, they do change. They are fairly different throughout all the different jurisdictions. And like the same way where the seller is getting, only has to disclose very little in Virginia, they also have rental laws that are favoring them as landlords. So hopefully that's making sense what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right. We could talk about like sort of like what the sort of, I guess you could say is like the theme or sort of like how rental laws favor one side over the other,
right?
In the 3 jurisdictions. Like before we get to that, like one sort of like last tidbit about like the inspections, things like that, right? Is that like still, even though if like for say Virginia, it's a buyer beware state, right? Like there are still limited protections for buyers, right? Like sellers can't like just outright lie to you, right? If they like know something and like consciously try to like board up the wall or something, right?
Right.
Definitely still illegal, right? So there's still protections, and then there are certain like affirmative disclosures. So yeah, I mean, not
that's
to say
fair.
that
That's
like
fair. That's fair. It's not like the wild west in Virginia where you're going in and the seller can light the house on fire and the buyer has no recourse. Like no.
Yeah. It's not like that episode of Breaking Bad where it's like just you can't go in the basement. I'm sorry.
No. Okay. Well, I'm glad you pointed that out so that everybody knows not to freak out about buying in Virginia.
That's right. Exactly. I mean, I live in Virginia, so
we'll get to that later.
It's right. That's right. So yeah, as far as rental laws go, right? So yeah, I mean, whenever someone like an attorney or any other kind of professional says like, oh, these laws are like landlord friendly or tenant friendly, right? Really, a lot of the times they're talking about like how difficult is it to sort of go through the legal process to evict someone, right? And so when they're talking about that, that's what they're saying for Virginia. It's that like, the processes to evict somebody are not sort of as complicated as sort of as far as like the length of time that notice has to be given and the number of appearances that an attorney or the landlord has to make to evict a tenant, right? So that's what they're saying when it comes to Virginia, is that sort of those procedures are more sort of streamlined for a landlord to hire an attorney or for them to do it themselves, right? Whereas in Maryland, DC, sort of you have more like parts to that process in order for them to, if you have an unsavory tenant, sort of how do you get them out of there, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and this happens to me. Having these conversations actually comes up a lot for me. So I recently worked with somebody who bought a investment property in DC, has owned several investment properties in like the Boston, Massachusetts area, and just really didn't understand the process of how rentals work here. I mean, it's clearly going to be a rental. This person has a house elsewhere, so they're not going to be living in that unit. Right. So we had to really get him educated on this stuff quickly. And a lot of the questions focused on what if this tenant ends up not being, good for whatever reason. Right. How do I get rid of him? And I was like, well, you pretty much you don't, unless there are very limited number of reasons how you can evict a tenant in DC. Right. And the process itself is arduous and, it can be challenging. So, I mean, I'm a landlord in DC. My first place I ever bought turned into a rental for me. So it's not impossible, but I think going in with your eyes open about this stuff is very important because it's just not the same from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just something that you have to consider. It's like, you will probably make more off of a rental in DC, probably, right, than Virginia. And there's probably like a higher demand for it. But yeah, you just have to factor in the possibility that there's an issue. Like there will be sort of more either legal expenses or more time spent evicting a person.
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody really wants to ever do that. But I think, we go to worst case scenario in our heads. So
Right.
Unfortunately,
Exactly.
yeah.
Why you hired an attorney, I guess.
Yeah. That's why I call you first, to make sure that we're
Right.
getting all our questions answered
Hmm.
up front. So yeah, so those are some of the main ones that are coming up with me. So, the
Hmm.
level of disclosure, the rental stuff, the taxes,
Hmm.
but there are other things, I mean, we can really touch on quickly, but if somebody's trying to decide where to live, aside from the, hey, I want to be close to a grocery store or close to where I work, or these are the schools I want my
Hmm.
child to potentially go to,
Yeah.
there are some very specific jurisdictional differences.
Hmm.
Um, the first of which is gun laws.
Yep.
So if you want to own a gun, you're going to have a much easier time doing that in Virginia
Hmm.
than DC. I mean, you're basically not going to be able to legally own one in DC. So you,
Yeah.
so
Basically.
yeah. So if you want to have, if that's
Mhm.
important to you, then that's a simple answer, right? If you need to have guns, and you're going to have a tough time living in DC and legally having those guns
Mhm.
on your premises.
Yeah, I mean, right. To put it in perspective, it's like DC is pretty much like it's a hard pass, right? You can't get a gun anywhere. Maryland, I believe you can, and then Virginia, I mean, I guess coincidentally because the NRA is like located in Fairfax, Virginia, right? Yeah, it's like it's super easy to get a gun, right? And then also if you want like a concealed carry permit, right? In Virginia, it's extremely simple. Like you do have to take a course and then just apply for a permit at the courthouse, and pretty much that's all you have to do, right? So yeah, that's something to definitely think about if that's something that you care about, right?
Sure. Yep. And okay, so let's talk about another kind of lifestyle one is
Yeah.
marijuana.
Hmm.
If marijuana is a part of your life, it is legal in the district and prohibited elsewhere. So again, it's if that's very, very important to you, those
Hmm.
laws are exceptionally different.
Yeah.
And so you're probably going to choose DC over the other two if that's something that is important to you.
Right. I think you just got to let your agent know. Although I suppose you should be honest, right? Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
like just going back to the first example, like the gun law thing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, like I have a cousin-in-law of mine, former military, right? And something to consider is like, yeah, there are no gun ranges in the district, right? And there's very few gun ranges in Maryland. But when you get over to Virginia, it's like it's not just the legal thing, but it's also like a proximity thing too. It's like if I'm
Right.
interested in like shooting, well, there has to be a range near me, right?
Right. Right.
Hmm.
Right. If I have a medicinal marijuana card, then I probably need to be near dispensaries, which are in
Right.
DC.
Exactly. That's right.
Another one that I didn't know until I moved to Virginia was about cars.
Yes.
So, talk to me a little bit about the difference between owning a car in these different jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. So Virginia has personal property taxes, right? So cars are taxed as personal property. So you got to pay in addition to your registration and sort of like the inspections and things like that. You also got to pay personal property taxes on your vehicles. Like, so you do get an exemption, like a minor credit if it's like your principal vehicle,
Mhm.
but then it's like still you got to pay a tax. Whereas in Maryland and DC, you don't have to. So yeah, that's something to consider. Is like the nicer your car is, the higher your tax is going to be, and you're going to have to pay it every year.
Eek.
Yeah, it's kind of it's deterred me actually. I like maybe I shouldn't buy a nice car. I'll just drive my beater. That's like as old as I am.
Well, we actually recently kind of dealt with some of the
Yeah.
car stuff because we bought
Mhm.
a vintage car, and,
Nice.
and I mean, so if you start really getting into some of the differences
Mhm.
in like registration and rules,
Right.
like in DC, if you have a vintage car and you want it to be a vintage car, you can only drive 1,000 miles a year.
Oh,
I know.
interesting.
I know. I mean, and that's the thing. That's the whole
Yep.
point. Is if one of these things is very important to
Mhm.
you, it
Right.
is a good idea to mention it to your agent when you're looking. Like
Absolutely.
if you had like 4 vintage cars, for example, you're
Mhm.
probably not going to live in DC just due to the sheer fact that you don't have anywhere to put them. But it's
Mhm.
if you did,
Right.
and you wanted to drive them all a lot, that would be
Mhm.
very, very hard to do
Yeah.
in DC. And so, and the fact of the matter is an agent might not know the answers to all this stuff, but they're your resource. Somebody like
Right.
you're a resource for anything having to do with the law.
Mhm.
And for me, I'm a resource probably more with the kind of lifestyle-y stuff, hopefully, or I can lead somebody in the right direction.
Mhm. 100%. Yeah. Exactly.
So I guess the question is, to end things, where do you live, Charles?
So, I've actually lived in all three jurisdictions, right? I started off when I was 20, I moved to the district and I lived there for 3 years. I lived in Maryland, Montgomery County, uh, for 3 years as well. And then for the rest of my time here, I've lived in Fairfax. So, I don't know. I mean, like, I think my interests kind of lined up with where I was at that stage in my life. So, like, yeah, when I was in DC, like, yeah, I was definitely a lot younger. So, like, being able to go to like Howard for like, party here and there, it was fun, right?
Yeah.
And then like as I got older, when I was in Maryland, I was in law school. So honestly, it was kind of a blur. But I enjoyed living there. And then once I got to Virginia, like life really slowed down. And I mean, it still has its fun parts, right? It's like, don't get me wrong, I love living in Virginia.
Mhm.
It's really convenient. Like if I need to go grocery shopping, everything's like I have a Wegmans, a Trader Joe's, and a Whole Foods like 5 minutes from me,
Nice.
right? So that's super awesome.
Yeah.
So it's like I think, yeah, at the end of the day, it's just like what you're interested in. Talk to your agent, and your agent probably has lived here longer than you have, right? So they'll have an idea
Yeah.
of if this fits for you.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, this goes to the main point I think I make in every single episode, which is that when you are buying or selling a home, we're
Mhm.
talking more about buying right now, but you have a team of people who are there at your disposal to help
Mhm.
get all of these questions answered.
Yeah.
And so, if there's something that's really important to you, then
Mhm.
you should let an agent know right away so that they can help
Mhm.
you. If it does really come down to the main overarching question, like where should I live?
Mhm.
Where is the more advantageous place for me to live? There's really no good answer to that because there isn't
Yeah.
monetarily one winner over the other, really,
Mhm.
or it's just so minor that it's more or less a wash at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So the main
Especially
takeaway is live where you want to live, man.
right, exactly. Especially if it's like your principal residence, right? It's like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, like, oh, it's cheaper to live in Virginia from a recordation tax perspective, right? But like you got to pay personal property taxes. So, economically it's kind of a wash sometimes. So really just pick a place that, you're happy with, right?
Yep.
And I think like as real estate professionals, I think we take pride in like sort of knowing the area that we live in, right? So like, when people do closings with me, I'm here in Old Town, right? So King Street is a very popular spot for people to like come on the weekends. And there's a lot of restaurants here. So like I take pride in like knowing like, hey, these restaurants here, this is what you'll like, or this is a place you should avoid or something like that, right? So just talk to your professionals that you're working with, to really make the most out of living here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on here today. If anybody's listening and you have
Mhm.
any real estate questions that you would need an answer from an attorney for, we can always introduce and we can leave your contact info in the show notes so that people could contact you directly too. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me,
All
Alison.
right.
I
Have a good
appreciate it.
one.
Take care.